Buenos dias, señoras y señores. And that's all the Spanish you're going to get out of me this morning. I do have a reason now for learning Spanish. I have a grandson who lives in Mexico City when he isn't in San Francisco. His mother is Natalia Almada, who is a well-known Mexican filmmaker. And she is producing grandchild number 2 sometime in July. So my wife and I are very excited about that. And we have added incentive so that the next time I'm here, next year perhaps, I'll be able to address you in Spanish, although I'm afraid my technical vocabulary might not be adequate to the task. Now, in theory, I'm going to be controlling the slides from here, but I also have my laptop to do, so let's see what happens. Now, I don't know whether that's legible for everyone in the background there, but I just want you to, if you can, read this without my repeating it to you. So I'll give you a few minutes to look at it. Okay, that's the end of your test, and if you didn't make it, the slides will be available to read later. So let me just start out by saying that if we are looking for a trusted internet, and that's what I think we are looking for, then there are a number of properties that I think we would all cite as evidence of a network that we can trust. One of them is reliability. You don't want something that just might work or has a high probability of working. You really want things to just work all the time. You certainly want safety, and that word, of course, covers a wide range of possible issues. Why would anyone use an internet that wasn't safe or they didn't feel safe in? Security is a very specific notion, and that is that if the system is vulnerable to being hacked, if your accounts and your personal information could be extracted, maybe your bank accounts and credit card information and things like that, why would you want to use an insecure system? If your privacy isn't protected, why would you want to use such a system? And as you know, with the General Data Protection Regulation coming into effect later this month in Europe and being adopted in similar forms elsewhere, privacy is a very important property, and one which is becoming increasingly protected by regulation. And once again, why would you use a system if you didn't feel that your privacy was protected? And finally, interoperability is important as well. If things don't interwork in the internet environment, then I think you'd be quite frustrated if, for example, a particular brand of laptop or mobile couldn't interwork with all the other brands. You probably wouldn't want to use such a system. So those are some of the properties that I would include. Security is not a single thing somewhere in the internet architecture that you focus on. It's a layered structure with many layers of protocol, and also even the devices that you use have hardware, of course, as the base, but then there's the input-output programs to move data in and out of the machine or to display it. There's the operating system, which manages the resources of these programmable devices, and then, of course, there are the applications that make the devices useful. So that's a layered structure as well. The protocols of the internet are also layered. The very low-level ones are physical signaling, sending ones and zeros. But then you get more structure as you move your way up the protocol stack. You get link-level framing protocols. You get flow control and reach through the internet protocol layers. And then you get end-to-end transport, TCP, FTP, UDP, the datagram protocols for real-time communication. It keeps going on up to applications. So the point to be made here is that The security problems arise in all the various layers, and so we have to address them in every layer based on the kind of vulnerabilities that we can identify at each of those. There's an interesting notion which is becoming quite popular in the core of the internet routing system, the routers that move internet packets around, and that's separating the paths that the data takes, the paths of the packets that contain data, and the control of the routers, keeping those separate. For those of you who are students of history, you may know that in the early 1950s, the telephone network used signaling using sound, tones, and they were in band in the same part of the telephone system as our speech. And so people were able to use little whistles and devices they called blue boxes because they were colored blue that generated the control tones for the telephone system. When the telephone company realized that people were stealing access to international calling using these in-band tones, they moved the control of the system out of band so that you couldn't control it through the same voice channel that carried your voice. The same thing is happening in the internet by separating control. The thing that I need to emphasize is that the attacks against the system are possible at every layer. And so you shouldn't allow someone to try to sell you safety and security by putting just one thing somewhere in the system and then claiming it solves all problems. There's something else which is very interesting, and that's the way in which hardware can be used to reinforce security in the network or in the applications that lie at the edges of the net or in the cloud. Many years ago at MIT, there was a project called MAC. It had nothing to do with hamburgers. It had to do with multi-access computing. The hardware that was used was modified in order to put some special controls in the system to inhibit the execution of certain sensitive instructions in the computer. And so the way this worked is that if you happen to execute an instruction that would store information into the middle of the operating system, the system would stop that instruction from executing and take you down into a special piece of software called the kernel. And it would ask, who are you and why do you think you can execute this instruction? And depending upon which ring of protection you were authorized to get access to, and there were 8, you either would or would not be allowed to execute that instruction, or you would have to show evidence that you had the authority to execute that sensitive instruction. So there were 8 levels of authority. At level 0 in the core, of course, you could do anything. That was called sort of the root, having access to the root. It's interesting that that same hardware exists in the x86 chips. These are the Intel-based chips that have been around for decades now. But that particular feature in the hardware hasn't been exercised very much in the last couple of decades or so, but it should be. We should use hardware to reinforce any software security methods that we might adopt. There are also some even more sophisticated computer designs that are called capability-based hardware, and without going into a great deal of detail about that, these are hardware-implemented ways of showing what capabilities your program should have when it's executing in the machine. If you haven't been able to obtain that particular capability, the machine will refuse to allow you to execute an instruction or allow you to store things in certain parts of memory. So those are important notions that we should keep in mind. Especially when you're establishing policy for security, keep in mind that it's a very, very rich palette of places where security needs to be applied. Some of you will have heard yesterday, I think, that strong authentication is a very important tool in the toolkit for increasing security in the network. Let me just start by observing that anonymity is not necessarily a bad thing. There are many cases where you would want not to be known as you're using the network. Perhaps you are a whistleblower reporting on a problem in a company or the government. Maybe you're just using the Google search appliance and you don't need Google to know who you are in order to use that. On the other hand, there are situations where you really want to know for sure, or with high probability, who is the other party that you're interacting with. So, for example, there might be a transaction of some significant monetary value. Maybe it's a loan, maybe it's a purchase, and you would like to be assured that the party you're dealing with is the one you think it is. And vice versa, the other party may want to know the same thing about you. So having the ability to strongly authenticate your identity is actually a protective measure so that someone else can't pretend to be you and then take an action that will appear to be something that you initiated. It's important that when we do transactions in the network, that there be some way for those transaction records to maintain the integrity of those transaction records. And similarly, when we download software from some source in the network, we would like to be assured that the software arrives intact. It hasn't been modified in some way before it got to you, possibly carrying some kind of virus or malware. And so digital signatures and hash codes that have been encrypted are tools that we can use to increase our confidence that content has not been modified. Blockchain is being used repeatedly. It's overhyped. It's not the solution to everything. Some people are saying blockchain is the new internet. I would be a little careful about jumping to that conclusion. There are limitations to the technology. It sometimes doesn't scale in the way that you might like. The rate at which you can establish new blocks in the blockchain may be limited. But it's not a useless technology by any means, but you should be very careful if you're writing policy not to be misled into thinking that blockchain will solve all of your authentication problems. One interesting thing about hardware-enforced security is that just as your computers are being started when they're booting up, one of the things that we can do is have the hardware check to see whether the software that's going to be loaded, the operating system, has a validity check, a cryptographically signed check, so that your machine doesn't accidentally boot up an operating system that's been altered. And so, again, this is an example of hardware-reinforced security. Two-factor authentication is really important, in my opinion. Humans, that's you and me, are not very good at picking passwords. In fact, there are some people who will pick the word password as their password because it's so easy to remember. The trouble is the bad people know that too. And so using easily guessed passwords is a very bad idea. Sometimes when people forget their passwords, which happens a lot, the systems that are trying to be helpful to a user will say, well, if you don't remember your password, maybe you can answer a secret question. And the trouble with the secret questions is that sometimes those questions have answers that you can find by searching in the internet. And so people often hijack other people's accounts either by guessing their passwords or using something called a dictionary attack, which, well, I won't go into details, but the dictionary can help you figure out what people's passwords are. Or they figure out what the answer is to the secret question and they take over your account. So two-factor authentication requires hardware typically, or at least a piece of software running in a separate device than your laptop or your desktop. So by way of example at Google, this is my Google badge. And I have attached to the Google badge a little device that generates a cryptographically produced password in addition to my username and password. So someone can't get into my account unless they have my username, my password, and this particular device, which generates a different password each time I ask it to. So two-factor authentication may be inconvenient, but it absolutely makes it a lot less likely that someone can take over your account because they don't have that. Now I want to shift gears. I'm sort of feeling compelled to jump around on different topics related to security. This one is a hot topic in technical circles because quantum computing is quite different from conventional computing. It allows us to compute things much, much more quickly that would otherwise take a very, very long time with a conventional machine. Typically, the cryptographic methods for public key cryptography use a particular mathematical hard problem, and that's the factoring of the products of large prime numbers. Now think about 15 has two factors, 3 and 5. Those are two primes. Or 14 has two factors, 2 and 7. Those are two primes. Interestingly enough, 2 is the only prime which is even. All the other primes are odd, because if they were even, then they would divide by 2. So if you have really, really big prime numbers and you multiply them together, and you use that particular big number as part of your cryptographic system, the party who's trying to break the cryptography has to figure out what are the two factors of a really big number. That takes a lot of time, even with a fast computer. Quantum computers, on the other hand, can collapse the amount of time it takes to find those two factors to something that's short enough to be worth the trouble to actually break the code. So the real question, that includes the RSA codes, which are so popular and that were originally developed in the late 1970s, and even the more modern elliptic codes are breakable using quantum computers. There's for people who get copies of the slides, there is a Wikipedia article which is quite good, outlining what the risks are of quantum computers being used to break cryptographic codes. For those of you who might be mathematicians in the audience, lattice-based mathematics is turning out to be one path for post-quantum protection for public key cryptography because it's not vulnerable to factorization. The symmetric algorithms, that's where both parties have the same key. That was the old style of doing crypto. It's still a good style for doing crypto because the codes typically aren't broken by quantum computing. The bad thing about symmetric codes is that while they are very fast, if both parties have the same code, they can fabricate messages, encrypted messages that could have come from the other party. That's one of the nice things about asymmetric cryptography. You can't fake someone else's message because you don't have the private key that would allow that to be generated. And of course, if you're really, really serious about security and you want an unbreakable code, don't let anyone sell you anything except what's called random bit streams, and they really have to be random. This is literally a sequence of ones and zeros that are generated, for example, by a leaky transistor or some other quantum process. That string of ones and zeros can be exclusive ORed with the text. It produces random cryptographic code. It's unbreakable for all practical purposes because there's no way to generate or regenerate that sequence of bits. The problem is that you have to deliver all of those random bits to the other side in order to allow that side to decrypt the message. And that makes it inconvenient for many, many applications, and hence we go back to asymmetric codes and symmetric ones. But quantum computing is an issue, needs to be addressed. Now, you and I can't escape a certain amount of responsibility for securing the systems that we use. If we are going to use passwords, we want them to be strong. Historically, that often has meant, well, put in funny characters and put in things that aren't words. But the real and most important thing is long passwords, because the longer they are, sometimes people call them passphrases. It's a phrase you can remember, but the other party has to work harder and harder the longer the code is. And so long passwords are a good thing, although they may be hard for you to remember, which is a big problem. And that's why two-factor authentication helps to solve part of that problem. And that's why, in fact, I didn't bring it with me, but I have an account at Barclays Bank in London. And when they issue the account, they also send you a little device that will read your credit card chip. And before you can log in to the Barclays Bank account, you have to put your credit card into this little device and then get a cryptographically generated identifier and then present that to the Barclays Bank online system. And that system once it knows which account you are, also knows what your cryptographic password should be, and it changes over time. And so it's clumsy to have to carry that little gadget with me wherever I go, but I actually feel very good about it because I know that nobody else has that little device. And so I feel safer, even though it's inconvenient. So I've come to the conclusion that we have to accept a certain irreducible amount of inconvenience if we want to be more safe and more secure in the online environment. But there are other things that we can do to protect ourselves. For example, don't click on suspicious hyperlinks that you encounter in your email or on a website. What I've tended to do when I receive an email that looks like it's somebody trying to get me to click on a link, you get an email, it looks like it came from someone you know, and it says, oh, you really have to click on this, it's really amazing, and then they give you a URL. I usually don't click. And if it's come from someone I know, I usually forward the message back to that party saying, did you send this? Oh, P.S., don't click on the link. And that has two benefits. The first one is you can find out whether they actually sent it. And second, it tells your friend that someone is trying to use their account for phishing, in case maybe their account has been hacked. Using other people's emails does not necessarily mean they hacked the account. The email system is not very good at guaranteeing whose email is in the from address. That's a long story over a beer someday. In the early days of ARPANET, the predecessor to the internet and the internet, we were all just a bunch of geeks, and we all pretty much trusted each other and didn't feel the need to put in a lot of security mechanisms. Well, welcome to the 21st century. Now we need to worry about that. Here's another problem. The URLs, the Uniform Record Locators of the World Wide Web, also can be very misleading. If you look at the two examples that you see here, wikipedia.org and wikipedia.org, the A in the first wikipedia.org is actually a Cyrillic character. It's not a Latin character. It has a different code in the Unicode system. You can't tell by looking at it that they're different, but the computer thinks they're two different places. And so if someone registers wikipedia.org with a Cyrillic A and somehow gets you to click on a hyperlink that you think is going to Wikipedia, it will take you to a different website. And of course, you can make up other scenarios. It's the bank that you're going to, or it's an account that you're trying to log into. So this mixing of characters has turned out to be a real challenge. The problems arise even in the same character set. The Latin codes are part of, for example, the American Standard Code for Information Interchange, or ASCII, has just Latin characters in it. But sometimes a lowercase l looks like a 1. And you can, depending on the font of the characters that are being used to present the URL, you may be confused into clicking on something. I've seen people click on strings that have exclamation points instead of ones in them, but if the font is too small, you can't tell it's an exclamation point, so you click on it anyway, and of course you end up in the wrong place. So we have a real problem with the character sets that are used in the World Wide Web. They're wonderful because they have the full richness of Unicode, and they're terrible because the domain names are sometimes registered with these character sets that lead to confusion. So there's something that Einstein said that I think is important here with regard to security. He said, things should be as simple as possible, but no simpler. Because if we're too simple in our models, we end up with serious security vulnerabilities. Now, I wanted to use the Internet of Things as a way of describing for you some of the problems when the models are too simple. There are some people who are building devices that are programmable, things like the thermostat in the house, or a little device to control a light bulb, like the Philips Hue light bulb. And these designers sort of think, okay, my model is there's a device, there's the internet or Wi-Fi, or Bluetooth or some network, and there's a user and an app on the mobile, and that's it. They imagine that they don't have to design for any scenarios other than that very simple one. Well, that's wrong. It turns out that when you start adding multiple devices into your Internet of Things environment, now you have a whole ecosystem to worry about. And as a system designer, you have to be thinking about the more complex cases, sometimes what are called the corner cases, the special cases, because those are the ones that will be exploited by the hackers. One thing that we should be thinking about is that the different brands of Internet of Things devices should be able to interwork. If they don't, it adds complexity to your life because you need different systems to control these different devices. You worry about someone, let's say that it's a home Internet of Things environment, smart house, and someone arrives in the house with a new device. And even imagine it's detected that there is a new device. Maybe it's a mobile, maybe it's a web camera, maybe it's something else. The system, your house system, needs to discover that because it might be you bringing a new device into the house. But what if it's just your friend who's casually stopping by, and the system discovers this device and then tries to add it into the control system of the house? Well, that's a mistake. The question is, how do we design the system so it knows it should not integrate this into its system? You particularly don't want your friend to suddenly get control over your house just because they stopped by one day to visit and have a drink or a cup of coffee. So you have to design the system to be really smart about that. There's also another big issue, and that's the fact that software has bugs. I mean, let's face it, I used to make a living writing software, and I have a little dent in my forehead from the many times that I was slapping my forehead saying, how could I be so stupid to make a mistake in the code? And the worst part is it's usually a stupid mistake, and it's hard to find because it's such a dumb mistake you can't imagine anybody, including you, making that mistake. So the problem we have is that we have to fix the mistakes, especially in the Internet of Things. But to do that, we have to have a path for downloading new software. But now we have to get paranoid and suspicious. We have to make sure that the device is getting the software from a legitimate source, not from a hacker. We have to make sure the device can tell whether the software has integrity. We need a digital signature on a hash of the code, for example, in order to make sure the device doesn't ingest something that has malware in it. So that requires an ecosystem to be constructed for software updates. One big question is, what responsibility does the vendor have for maintaining the software and correcting mistakes? Some vendors of IoT devices are happy to just sell the device to you and then forget about you. And if there are bugs that get exploited later, the vendor says, don't look at me, I've already got your money. So the question is, what regulatory rules should we impose on the makers of these devices to assure that they will support them during the lifetime of the device? Of course, some companies will simply go out of business, not by intent, but just because of circumstances, in which case now you have a problem. What do I do with the device that has bugs in it? Do I replace it with something else? Do I live with it and pray? Do I find a third party to come out and try to fix the problem? Another thing which we should care a lot about is making sure we can see what's going on with an ensemble of devices to see whether or not they're being hacked, whether or not they're performing correctly, whether they are doing something wrong, or worse, they're doing everything they should do and something else as well. I used to say that my big worry was a headline that said, 100,000 refrigerators attack Bank of America. Well, it's not funny anymore because 500,000 webcams attacked a company here in the US called Dyn Corporation, which happened to be responsible for domain name resolution for a number of companies. So when Dyn Corporation got wiped out by a 500 gigabit per second attack with 500,000 webcams all aiming their megabit videos at this one target, when Dine Corporation was overwhelmed, a whole lot of companies disappeared off the net because their domain names couldn't be resolved. So there are consequential damages associated with denial of service attacks. So noticing what's going on, especially that your refrigerator is contributing to a denial of service attack and has become part of a botnet, is an important task for instrumentation to try to overcome. In fact, when you have devices like little light bulbs and things like that that may not have very much computing power in them, then you may want to only use it in an environment where there is an additional firewall between the device and the rest of the internet that limits who or what gets access to the control of those devices in the house or in your office or in the car or even on your person. I mean, think about the devices, medical devices that will be instrumenting our health or maybe even controlling things like insulin pumps. You certainly do not want external parties to get access to those controls. I do have to tell you one thing that the former president of Estonia often says. He says he's less concerned about the privacy of his medical records than he is about their integrity. And he offers as an example, if someone gets into his medical records and changes his blood type, if he ever had a transfusion, he might die because it would be the wrong type of blood. So he says, I'm more worried about the accuracy and integrity of my medical record than I am about its privacy. Okay, so here are some other examples of the Internet of Things, and because it's, let me see how we're doing. Oh, good, we have some time. So one thing that I worry about, back to those simple models, is that if it's just one device and one app and the mobile, that's fairly easy. But what if you have 80, 90, 100 devices in your house? Can you imagine to try to control the house, flipping through 80 different apps to try to find how to turn the lights off and on, or how to flush the toilet or something? We really need to be thinking about scaling up and creating easily used systems. There's another big problem that I foresee in the residential setting. There are many different people who might live in the same house. There are parents, there are children, there are guests, there are friends, there are grandparents, emergency responders, and they should not all have the same ability to control the house. You don't want the children to unlock the house in the middle of the night. You don't want a burglar walking by to say, unlock the house, and have the house unlocked by automatically. So now the system has to distinguish somehow among these various users and figure out what their authority should be. Some people have suggested voice recognition and speaker identification as the solution to the problem. I'm still very skeptical of this. I mean, what if somebody recorded your voice? What if the system guesses wrong and gets it wrong? Or worse, what happens if you have a worker who has come in to do some work, brings devices with him or her, which are recognized by your house and become part of its system, and then uses that remotely in order to unlock the house or do some other kind of damage? It gets very tricky to figure out how to cope with all of this. There's also the question about emergency responders. So let's imagine for a moment that the house is on fire and your neighbor has called the fire department, thank goodness, and the fire department is on its way. You might want the fire department under those circumstances to have access to web cameras inside the house to see where is the fire burning, is there anyone who is unconscious. The same thing might be said for the police who are coming because the house has been broken into and there are people in there. They might want to be able to see what's going on inside the house before they actually go in. It's all very reasonable, but after the emergency is over, you don't want the fire department and the police department or the emergency medical responders to have that same access to your home and its web cameras and other equipment. So we have to have a way of both granting and taking away authority to manage and control the house. And just how that's going to work is not so clear. But that's why this is an important security topic to be considered, and that's why the designers of these systems have to keep these kinds of scenarios in mind. Another kind of question for the designers is, how hard is it to add a new user to the system? Imagine, for example, that your home, let's say your living room is like this, well, maybe not quite this big, but it has lots of different lights in it. And you have to figure out how to tell the system to turn on which light. Now, in today's world, you have switches for the different lights, and you learn which switch controls which light. But what if you only have a voice interface? Do you have to have a big debate with your system to figure out which light you wanted to turn on? What if you wanted to introduce a guest to your house, and the guest needs to turn the lights off and on? Do you have to give names to the lights, like Jorge and Manuel, and then you have to teach your guests, the names of all the lights? I mean, that's not going to work. So we have all kinds of scenarios where we have to figure out what is convenient for the users. How quickly can they learn to control the house? How quickly can we take away their privileges? How easily can we take away their privileges? Now, just imagine what happens when somebody else moves into the house. They just bought your house. It has 100 devices in it. What is the ritual that you have to perform in order to transfer control of the devices to the new owner? What happens if that new owner brings another 100 devices in and doesn't want to spend the weekend typing IPv6 addresses into some control system in order to configure the house? So, I mean, these are all examples of how complicated this gets and how failure to deal with the problems creates security risks. Earlier, before we opened up, I was having a conversation with one of you, and the question of ethics came up. And there's no doubt in my mind this is a huge ethical issue on top of it being a technical one. One question is whether the makers of these devices will commit to maintaining the software and the device over the lifetime of the device. This becomes a bigger issue when you're buying equipment that might have a lifetime of 30 or 40 years. For example, major appliances in the house, the air conditioning, the heating, security systems, and things like that, even kitchen equipment. And so is the supplier going to make a commitment? Should regulations say it has to make that commitment? I don't have an answer to that question, but you can see why it's an important one. Another thing, of course, is to assure that there is an effort to distribute software that isn't vulnerable and that fixes bugs. You certainly want to make sure that when there's a new release of software, that the vendor of the software has tested to make sure not only that it does the new thing, but it still does all the old stuff too. Otherwise, you have new features and the system doesn't work the way you expect. You want some assurance that there's resistance to external attacks. I should have put in internal attacks too, where somebody's in the house legitimately and trying to get control over your system. You want to be assured that your privacy is protected. You don't want the web cameras to be accessible to just anyone. On the other hand, you want this ability for the emergency responders to get access to them under certain circumstances. You certainly want them to be easy to use. I mean, why would you want a house or an office full of this kind of equipment that turns out to make your life harder than easier? And in fact, if a company might go out of business and the devices with that software are going to last for a long time, you might require that the party making these systems put the code, the source code, in escrow so that if they go out of business, you have the ability either to get access to that code or a third party can get access to it to maintain the software for the remainder of the lifetime of those devices. So this is my last slide, and I think we managed to keep this pretty well in time. So the first thing is that you are, whether you like it or not, you're going to be surrounded by buggy code. I'm sorry to tell you that, but it's certainly based on the last 80 years of programming. I'm afraid that's true. Some of it is not going to get adequate support after its installation. And the question will be, what rules should we adopt and try to enforce in order to mitigate that problem? Let me also remind you that enforcement may not be the only mechanism for achieving the desired result, which is software which is maintained and bugs that get fixed. The companies that make these things need to have incentive to maintain the software and to fix mistakes. And those incentives could be financial, or they could even be more severe. For example, you might have a licensing arrangement, and they would say, if you continue to produce software that you don't maintain, or you fail to repair mistakes, it will take your license away and you can't sell that anymore. Or the government will refuse to buy any software of that type. Now, some people will say, well, what about open source? Doesn't that solve all the problems? And the answer is no, it helps, because open source means that anyone can look at the code. But there are at least two problems with this. The first one is, how do you know whether the open source code is what's running in a device? And second, in many cases, open source systems don't get enough attention. The assumption is it's open source, so everybody will be looking for bugs, and the result is nobody bothers looking for bugs because they think it's somebody else's responsibility. So open source has not necessarily been the solution to the problem. In fact, in some ways, it exacerbates the problem. For example, there are people who make devices with software in them, and they need an operating system. So they go to the open source library and they just grab any operating system that happens to be available and put it into the device and sell it. So I'm not against open source. I actually am in favor of it. So is my company at Google. But we have to keep in mind what the implications are of open source and not to rely excessively on the security features that open source might offer. Some of the software and the devices that it animates won't meet the reliability and privacy and safety expectations of the users. And at some point, there is a boundary that gets crossed, and the regulatory environment might say, these devices are unacceptable in the marketplace. They are too hazardous or potentially hazardous for our consumers. We will not permit them to be used. So you can imagine export constraints or import constraints. You can imagine domestic constraints on who can and can't sell what kind of hardware and software. So there are clear roles for regulation here if you can figure out what to regulate. And I want to emphasize this is hard. It's hard to say exactly what is allowed and what is not allowed. There is an example here in the U.S. Senator Warner, who is a senator from my state of Virginia, has introduced legislation for use by the U.S. government speaking about the Internet of Things and saying, here are the criteria that should guide government purchase and use of these kinds of devices. If they don't satisfy the following properties, the government should not buy and use them, should not prescribe their use. This doesn't say anything about consumers, but it does put a rule in place which could be enforceable because it's government procurement that is in question here. It's an attempt to speak fairly generally about the properties that these devices should have. And it's worth at least looking at to see where Senator Warner got in that particular legislation. So as you can tell in the last couple of bullets, this new world could be a utopia where all kinds of things are done automatically for us. We have ease of use. It's easy to add new devices. It's easy to bring in friends and family and guests and so on, and to say goodbye to them and remove their access conveniently. Or it could be a tremendous nightmare. And the answer to this, or the outcome, is very dependent on what the software people end up doing. And so in the end, it's our responsibility as technologists and as legislators to try to make sure that we end up more on the utopia side than we do on a nightmare side. but it isn't going to be simple. It isn't going to be easy. We have technical issues, we have legal issues, and we have financial and other incentive issues that have to be brought together in order to make the internet world a safe and secure one. And so that's the task that you and I have in this 21st century, is to create the right kinds of rules, enforceable ones, and the right kinds of incentives to achieve that objective. So I'll stop there. Muchas gracias for your time. And I don't really have any time. I have to get to another event, so I'm apologizing for not doing questions. But I'll answer email questions if you accumulate them and respond then. So again, muchas gracias.
Many thanks. Been very inspiring. A lot to think about. Mucho para pensar. Y
I forgot. I've just been, stupid. You're having a birthday. It's your 10th birthday. This is fabulous. Congratulations. Happy birthday. That's no mean feat. That is a very significant accomplishment. And bringing people from such a diverse range of interests and places is equally impressive. And I love this particular building for that purpose. So congratulations.